This is the City of London. I've lived in various flats and houses in various parts of this city for almost 10 years. Of all the places I've spent time in down here, the one that had the most effect on me is this one. Because this is St Martin's School of Art, and the reason I moved to London in the first place was to study filmmaking here. Although I never actually did any painting whilst I was there, I was in an art college, and that meant that I got to hear lots of other people's ideas of what art was all about. It soon struck me that these people didn't have a clue about what interested everyone else on a daily basis. It was as if art and everyday life had become mutually exclusive. Towards the end of the course I had to write a thesis, and by then this divorce between art and reality was getting to be a bit of an obsession with me. So, desperate to find a spark of inspiration, something that would help me to put these feelings into words, I began to scour the college library. There was no shortage of material on offer, but none of it seemed to fit the bill. I needed to find something outside all this, something that hadn't been analysed to death. And then when I'd all but given up hope of such a thing existing, I found it. In a book called Outsider Art. The book was about art made by people from all walks of life, who didn't think of themselves as artists, but were creating things because they felt they had to, rather than because they'd been taught to. Although the book featured paintings and sculptures, it was the photographs of unusual buildings and monuments that really caught my imagination. How could there be a gap between art and everyday life, if every day you lived inside the work of art you created? This was exactly what I was looking for. I'd found much more than just a subject for an essay. I'd found something I could really get excited about, and I vowed that if I ever got the chance, I'd go and find out more about these incredible places and the people who'd made them. Now, almost a decade later, that time has come. My thesis was awarded the second lowest mark in the year. I was setting out from London for France, my destination being Haute-Rive, a small village near Lyon. This is the home of the Palais Ideal, the building on your screens just a short while ago. It was built towards the end of the 19th century by a man called Ferdinand Cheval, the village postman. It took him 33 years to complete, and he constructed it single-handedly with no prior experience of building. For some reason, Britain has hardly any of these types of places, whereas France has quite a few. So on my way to the postman's palace, I planned to visit as many other sites as I could, and wherever possible meet the people who'd made them. It felt exciting to be setting out on such a voyage of discovery. But I also had to admit that I was a bit nervous. For 10 years I'd fantasised about such a journey. Now it was underway, I just hoped I'd be up to the job. I had a French phrase book, a digital camera, a hire car to get around in, and a film crew following me to capture the whole thing in gory detail. All I needed now was a drink to calm my nerves. The bar was packed with tourists, so I decided to visit the duty-free instead. Down in my cabin, I checked the quality of the merchandise and made sure my camera was working properly before turning in for the night. It was a rough crossing, but I awoke feeling rested and ready to visit my first site, a place made around the same time Postman Cheval had been working on his palace. Some granite carvings called Les Rochers Sculptés, on the north coast of France, just 4 miles east of Saint-Malo. As I drove, I listened to the Easter Sunday morning Mass on the car radio, which seemed appropriate, as the place I was about to visit was made by a retired priest. My adventure was about to begin. A decade ago I'd seen something in these places. Now it was time to find out exactly what that something was. When I first came down here, I found it quite confusing really, because everything kind of merges into one. You can't really kind of pick out individual things. And it's quite weird really, because suddenly you'll be looking at a bit of rock, which you think is just a lump of rock, and then you start to pick out features on it, and you can see that there is a face there and stuff like that. And it definitely helps, like when the sun comes out, suddenly you get shadows and stuff, and that really starts to define things. And it's quite weird, it's like faces come out of the rock, and I'm not on the LSD, you know what I mean? No.
Some people might wonder what the Abbé Fauré had been on though, to make him spend the last 16 years of his life carving over 300 sculptures on this headland. You might expect a man of the cloth to have chosen to work on something with a religious theme. But instead, the sculptures showed the adventures of the Rotten Earths, a legendary family of pirates who were supposed to live nearby. It was like a giant comic book carved out of stone. But why go to all that trouble when the story it told would mostly have been seen only by the local seagulls?
While I was in the clergy, I never even dreamt of doing anything like this. But when I retired here, the idea came to me to sculpt a few rocks as a way of keeping busy. Often, after having looked hard at a pile of granite, while the sea's voice lulled my dreaming, I would see a face drawing itself in stone. When this stopped, I set myself resolutely to work.
I'm sure he could have found an easier way to pass the time though, especially as he'd suffered a stroke just before his 54th birthday, which had left him partially paralysed. Nowadays, the Abbé's audience has expanded beyond the local wildlife, but the combined effect of the influx of tourists and the constant action of the sea means that the sculptures are gradually being eroded away. In a few years' time, the headland would be back to the state it was in when the Abbé first had his visions. But as I discovered, even now it's sometimes difficult to distinguish between the work carried out by a retired priest 100 years ago and that done by the forces of nature since the start of time. I guess if you've got the time to look hard enough and long enough at anything, then you might end up seeing a face in it. The next day I drove east towards Rouen. I'd arranged to meet a man called Claude at a motorway exit near the town of Louviers.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Monsieur Vasseur?
Oui.
Ah,
Comment
Jarvis.
allez-vous?
Jarvis.
D'accord.
Alors,
Claude was taking me to see his dad, a retired milkman, who for the past 46 years had been doing something very unusual to his house. Unlike yesterday, where the place I'd seen was completed years ago and was now gradually disappearing, this place was still being worked on. So I hoped that would give me a chance to find out more about what motivated people to do this kind of thing.
Probably not allowed to park there. I'll try. Stone cladding used to be big in our neighbourhood, but I'd never seen anyone cover the house in broken crockery before. C'est amenable parce que j'ai bloqué le...
Non.
Okay? Maybe all that I was going to discover today was that no one could understand my bad French. Bonjour.
Voilà, Robert Vasseur.
Bonjour.
Monsieur, bonjour.
Je m'appelle Jarvis. J'ai voyagé d'Angleterre pour voir la maison. Oui, pour vous.
Mais pas voir.
I appreciated Robert finishing my sentence for me. Otherwise, we could have been standing there all day. As it was, he immediately started giving me a guided tour.
L'eau, elle vient en bas, elle monte là-haut, elle redescend en cascade. Et quand il tombe de l'eau, c'est toi qui alimente.
Les Indiens?
Le vent. Oui, le vent. Là, c'est un salon d'antiquité. Là, tu mets sécher le linge.
Il y a beaucoup de coquilles. Vous allez à la mer avec un camion?
Ah non!
On va aller chercher chez le poissonnier.
Et le papillon?
Le papillon, oui.
Pour vous?
Je l'ai collé là, il ne s'est jamais envolé.
Mais pour vous, des papillons avoir une significance?
Oui.
C'est pourquoi?
C'est-à-dire que c'est un dessin facile à faire.
It seemed that if anything stayed still long enough, Robert would mosaic it. And he certainly had a sense of humour as well. But I did want to get him onto the slightly more serious subject of why he'd started doing all
Robert,
this.
Écoute ce qu'il dit.
Je me demandais quelle est l'inspiration pour commencer à faire tout ça?
Je prends comme une idée.
Oui, et ça a commencé par le fond de l'évier.
Une idée. Oui. J'ai fait une cuisine de plus. En plus, pour agrandir. Et puis dans ma cuisine, j'avais fait un évier en ciment armé. Puis la patronne n'était pas contente parce qu'elle ne pouvait pas le nettoyer. J'ai mis de la vaisselle cassée dedans. J'ai continué. Et puis l'évier a débordé sur toute la maison.
Pensez-vous que vous êtes différente des autres gens?
Non, j'ai fait ça, moi, d'autres peuvent le faire. Il y a ceux qui font un peu de patience. Et c'est tout. Moi, j'ai fait ça. Mais le premier maçon qui a fait la première maison, qui a montré? Personne. Il a fallu qu'il se débrouille. C'est ce que j'ai fait, moi, je me suis débrouillé.
Robert seemed determined to play down what he'd done, simply saying that it had started as a solution to a domestic problem. But once he had begun, he seemed to have become addicted to the pleasure it gave him. In fact, Claude did say that he thought his dad was drugged on broken crockery. I thought that maybe this could also explain why the Abbé Fourie had worked outside in all weathers. Yesterday it had mystified me why he'd gone to all that trouble, but today I realised that if a person could get so much pleasure from the work, then maybe it didn't feel like work at all. I suppose everyone attempts to personalise the surroundings, to try and do something that reflects who they are. But Robert had definitely followed this basic urge a lot further than most people ever do. Votre santé, merci beaucoup. I'm sure I could have stayed in his house all night, drinking homemade Calvados with him. But I had to bear in mind the fact that I had a long drive ahead of me. So before leaving, I had to attend to a basic urge of my own. Ooh. I can feel it. It shouldn't have surprised me that Robert, of all people, would have tiled the smallest room in the house. But in my eagerness to record his handiwork, I dropped my spare camera battery down his toilet. The places I'd seen so far on my journey might not have conformed to everybody's idea of beauty, but I reckoned that most people would be able to appreciate them. But the next place I was going to, now that was a different story altogether. I'd driven east to a little village called Viry to see the house of a Ukrainian man called Bohdan Litniansky. He'd come to France in the 1930s to visit his brother and had never gone back since. I say I'd come to see the house, but that was easier said than done, because it was virtually invisible behind the complex of strange totem pole-like structures that surrounded it. Every available surface was covered in debris, but not in any structured way like at Robert Vasseurs the day before, more as if someone had emptied the contents of a skip over the whole area. Needless to say, I thought it looked great, but it did get me wondering as to what kind of person would do such a thing.
Bonjour. Bonjour, messieurs. Comment ça va?
Pas mal. Vous êtes Monsieur Litniansky?
Oui, c'est Monsieur Litniansky, oui.
Je m'appelle Jarvis. J'ai voyagé d'Angleterre pour voir votre jardin.
Ah, c'est bien ça.
C'est possible?
C'est possible, oui, oui, c'est possible. Tout possible. Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Bonjour tout le monde. Hein.
Any misgivings I might have had disappeared straight away, and Bohdan was soon giving me a guided tour, just like the previous day. Only this time, it wasn't quite as easy to get around.
Le plus beau de tous les tangos du monde, c'est celui que j'ai dansé dans vos bras.
Collectionnez-vous tous les objets vous-même?
Pas de l'aide à personne.
Alors?
Je collectionne et puis je charrie avec cette remorque là-bas.
Et vous voyagez dans les rues et
dans les rues partout.
Des objets?
Voilà, ramasser dans les décharges publiques.
Oui.
Des objets trouvés, perdus, je ramasse, je mets dedans, je ramène. Puis c'est dedans.
The place didn't seem to have any order to it, but Bohdan told me that in his dreams he received instructions as to exactly where to put things. So there was some kind of method at work, even if I couldn't see it.
J'ai fait un trou.
Un trou, oui, oui.
Je mets béton, ferraille et béton. Hein? Et après, je mets un tube comme ça. Et après, je maçonne jusqu'à l'échafaudage. Après, il y a un autre ferraille qui va comme ça, un autre ferraille comme ça. On appelle ça étagère en France. Étagère.
C'est bon parce qu'on voit seulement des objets, pas,
pas de ciment. Non, c'est pas bon. Ciment, ça fait gris, c'est plus bon, c'est pas original. Ça, c'est original. Regardez. Ça, on ne met pas dedans, on met extérieur. On met ici.
Mais pourquoi vous aimez
c'est parce qu'il y a sculptage, c'est sculpté ça. Un béton n'est pas sculpté. Le brique n'est pas sculpté non plus. C'est sculpté, regardez, c'est beau. Hein?
I wasn't sure that I did find the stone beautiful, but I had no doubt at all in my mind that Bohdan did. He was working according to his own set of rules, and this might lead to some of his claims seeming a bit far-fetched to the rest of us, something I discovered more about later.
J'ai même 2 piliers qui étaient tombés. Je vous le voir tout à l'heure. Ils sont tombés, mais je reconstruis pareil. Hein.
C'est possible pour vous de rappeler où toutes les pièces
ça sera... Oui. Je récupère les pierres par ici, par là, de l'autre, comme ça, le mortier, et puis je reconstruis pareil.
des autres gens, peut-être, ils plantent des légumes dans le jardin.
Oui, c'est pas la peine de se casser derrière dans le jardin. Compris?
Oui.
Pourquoi faire un jardin avec des légumes presque pour rien? Hein? Autant faire des piliers. Hein?
I couldn't quite see the allotments of England suddenly being transformed into sculpture parks overnight, but I thought that I did understand where Bodden was coming from. The barrier that surrounded his house wasn't something to hide behind. It was more like a V sign to the rest of the world. If people thought he was crazy for filling his garden with rubbish, that was their problem. Bodden was about to set off on his daily search for materials. I guess for him, looking around the local tip was the same as what parading the Isles of Ikea is to other people. I'd have loved to have gone with him, if only to have seen what kind of stuff he actually rejected. But it was time for me to get on my way.
Au revoir.
Allez, au revoir. Hein?
My own search was far from over yet. I reached the Novotel just before midnight. Bodden Litniansky would probably have found the decor a little sparse, but I didn't have time for these kind of thoughts, as before going to bed I had to watch a videotape that I'd brought with me from England. Monsieur G spent over 30 years building and painting a house in the tiny village of Nel in northeastern France. He died in 1988, and the house had since been bought by one of his neighbours, who was reported to be in the process of carrying out extensive renovations. There was a very good chance that the house I'd be seeing the next day wouldn't bear any resemblance to the one shown in this film made in 1976. The place looked pretty amazing to me, and I found it hard to believe that anyone would be able to bring themselves to destroy it. But as they're fond of saying in my part of the world, there's no accounting for taste, is there? In the worst weather of the trip so far, I set off to meet someone who seemed to share my interest in Monsieur G. Clovis Prévost was the man who'd made the film I'd watched the night before. Along with his wife Claude, he'd also written a book about this and other sites in France.
Pour nous, ce qui nous intéresse, c'est un mécanisme de la création qui s'expose comme ça d'une manière brute, naturelle, spontanée. On se rend compte que la création n'appartient pas qu'aux créateurs professionnels, qu'aux artistes dans le circuit des musées et des galeries. La création, elle est propre à l'individu.
Et pendant les ans que vous avez fait la film, découvrez-vous pourquoi il a commencé à bâtir ce bâtiment?
Et en fait, on s'est aperçu qu'il faisait son automusée, quoi. Il construisait avec ses souvenirs, les morts des enfants, la mort de la femme, tous ces côtés un peu dramatiques. Donc c'est pas seulement une maison, c'est aussi un espèce de monument à sa propre vie.
Clovis hadn't been back to the house since Monsieur G's death, so neither of us knew quite what we were letting ourselves in for.
Alors, Clovis,
Oui.
votre première impression de la maison maintenant?
La maison, c'est un peu un désastre, quoi. C'est le triomphe de l'idiotie et de l'ignorance.
Clovis's remarks weren't exactly going to endear us to the house's new owner, Monsieur Auberjan, who refused to talk on camera, but did eventually give us permission to look inside.
C'est très curieux. En fait, la maison, elle est construite autour d'un grand vide, d'une salle de projection. Donc c'était un petit théâtre, comme une petite scène de théâtre avec l'écran au fond, des images de chaque côté, un peu de décoration, et au fond, un espace pour le projecteur.
Monsieur G, une première.
Son idée, c'était d'un jour pouvoir projeter des images aussi qu'il avait accumulées. Mais il ne l'a jamais fait parce qu'il avait l'électricité prévue, mais ça n'a jamais vraiment fonctionné. Donc ça restait un petit peu symbolique en train, quoi. L'ensemble de la maison était quasiment inhabité. Lui habitait seulement un minuscule espace, un peu souterrain, dans lequel il vivait, il dormait, il faisait sa cuisine. C'était une espèce de pièce commune. Donc c'était un peu comme un escargot à l'intérieur de sa coquille, si vous voulez.
Of the 3 houses I'd seen on my trip up to now, this was by far the strangest. Houses are for living in. What Monsieur G had constructed wasn't a home. As Clovis had put it earlier, he'd built a museum of himself. I didn't like to see the place in this sorry state, and it upset me to think that eventually the same thing would probably happen to the other 2 houses I'd seen so far. But I now realised that it was impossible to expect anyone to live inside another person's personality. I suppose if you like a type of art because it seems more rooted in real life, then you can't really complain when real life decides it wants to redecorate.
Monsieur
Oh, bah dis donc.
je suis en retard.
Vous êtes au moins 5 minutes en retard. Ça va bien.
Monsieur Roland was the stepson of Raymond Isidore, a man who was once the city's gravesweeper, but who had always resented this lowly status. I was in Chartres to see a place that had managed to outlive its creator. Maison Picassiette is now owned by the city's art museum. 50 years ago, it was Monsieur Roland's home.
Je pense que peut-être c'est libre pour vous d'entrer ici.
Oh oui, oui, oui. Oui, oui.
Monsieur Roland's stepfather, Raymond Isidore, started building his own house in 1930, which was not an unusual thing to do at the time. What was unusual was that when he'd finished it, he then proceeded to cover it in mosaic. And when the place was completely clad, both inside and out, he then bought more land and erected walls and outbuildings, which he also covered in mosaic, while his family remained in the cramped 3-roomed house.
C'est étrange pour vous parce que maintenant c'est une attraction touristique, mais pour vous c'est une place que vous avez habitée.
Oui, remarquez, je suis toujours en admiration dans ce qu'il a fait. Et je me rappelle avoir vécu tout ça.
Mm-hmm.
Il y avait des tas d'assiettes partout, il y avait de la poussière, il y avait tout, quoi. Enfin, il fallait l'endurer. La plus méritante dans tout ça, c'est ma mère. Ma mère qui a vécu avec lui dans la poussière. Oui.
The museum is now very popular, with over 30,000 paying customers a year. But even in Raymond Isidore's lifetime, it had begun to attract visitors.
Ça, c'est les troncs. C'était à la porte, de chaque côté de la porte.
Mm-hmm.
Les gens, ils venaient, ils passaient, hop, ils mettaient un tronc. Puis des fois, le tronc il se remplissait. Hein. Ah oui. Ouais, oui. Ça y avait même tourné la tête, trop d'argent.
Oui.
Ah oui.
L'argent, c'est un effet mauvais pour lui.
Ah oui, oui.
Oui.
Parce qu'un jour, il n'y en avait pas du tout, puis après, il en a eu trop. Un jour, on est convoqué au commissariat de police. Et on est dit, tenez, alors j'y vais. Voilà ce qu'on a trouvé à la décharge publique. Des sacs avec toute la monnaie qu'il y avait là-dedans. Il avait été jeté ça à la carrière, aux décharges. Il était venu, il était un peu soigné de la tête. Hein. Il était en hôpital psychiatrique au moins deux, 3 fois.
I work as if I'm guided by a spirit, something which controls me. Once it's taken root in my mind, it spreads through my whole body into my hands and fingers. I am compelled to work.
Maybe it was because I knew more about Raymond Isidore's life story now. But what he'd done didn't look like the work of someone who'd enjoyed covering the property and bits of broken things. It seemed more like he'd been desperately trying to put those things back together again.
Vous avez senti de faire une chose comme ça?
Pas du tout.
Non?
Non. C'était pas mon père, c'était mon beau-père. Hein. Alors il y a
Oui,
pas d'égalité entre nous. Hein. J'ai des goûts artistiques quand même, comme tout le monde, mais pas au point d'en faire comme ça. J'ai jamais eu envie de faire de mosaïque. Non. Alors,
Vous avez assez de mosaïques?
Oui, oui, il y en a assez.
Dans votre vie?
Oui, c'est vrai. Oui.
One day, the year before he was set to retire from grave sweeping, Raymond set out from the house with the intention of walking the 56 miles to Paris in search of materials, but he never returned. He was found in the road about 10 miles away. He died from exhaustion. His body now lies here, in the graveyard he used to keep clean. All the people I'd come across so far were what you might call obsessive characters to some extent, but Raymond Isidore's obsession led him to an early grave. Perhaps he didn't have much of a choice though, seeing as when he was alive, it was the only thing that gave him any sense of pride. Maybe you don't have to be mad to build a large-scale visionary environment, but it helps. I was now searching for Shomo, a man who was different to the rest of the creators I'd met so far. A man who did have artistic training, but who had then turned his back on society, as well as his wife and kids, and gone to live alone in the forest of Fontainebleau near Paris, where he'd led the life of a virtual recluse for the last 50 years.
Si vous voulez pas vieillir, faites comme Shomo, creusez la terre. Vous ne serez jamais malade, vous ne grossirez jamais. Vous serez toujours bien portant.
He'd started off just doing his paintings and sculptures, but this had developed into him building a whole environment out in the woods and creating work through all kinds of different methods.
Il faut travailler pour ne pas vieillir. Si vous commencez à vous asseoir, vous êtes foutu. Vous n'avez plus qu'à commencer à préparer votre cercueil.
About 20 years ago, Clovis Prévost shot this film about him and his work. But since then, Shomo had been courted by a female admirer, and perhaps under her influence had become even more reclusive, and had abandoned all his former friends. He didn't have a phone, so I'd written to him to arrange my visit. At first he seemed enthusiastic, but became difficult when he found out that the programme wasn't going to be just about him. He considered himself unique, and not to be compared to anyone else, least of all a bunch of amateurs labelled as outsider artists. As far as he was concerned, he wasn't outside culture, he was beyond it. Eventually, he said he didn't want to participate in what he called fuckwit cinema. Not bad for a man of 91. After a couple more letters, he did agree to meet me though, but only on the condition that no cameras were used. I was hoping he might change his mind once we'd met. But as I pulled up, I noticed something that made me think I might not even get that far.
Okay, I'm on the road leading up to Chomo's house now. It's just up there. I noticed earlier that the gate is still locked, so I can't even go down and bang the gong to try and get his attention. So I'm going to have to go over there and shout as loud as I can, and hopefully he'll hear us. Come over, and if I can persuade him that what we're trying to do is something that is a good thing to do and that we're not trying to take the piss out of him in any way, then maybe he'll let us in with the cameras, but we'll just have to see what happens. Hello? Monsieur Chomo? Monsieur Chomo? Bonjour. Monsieur Chomo! It's difficult to know how long to wait for, really, because I don't want to keep shouting, and if he can hear me and he's ignoring me, it might piss him off, and there is a chance that we can come back tomorrow and try. There's absolutely no sign of anything going on down there at the moment. I may as well show you a few bits here. Well, this is his sign here. It kind of lists the things that he does. It's quite long, as you can see. I can kind of make it out. Architecture, sculpture, painting, apiculture. I think he keeps bees. Printing, free music, poetry, freedom, religion, drawing, cinema, reincarnation, cosmic force, the corridor of dreams, life, death, basically everything. I'm wondering whether to... I've got a bottle of port here, which apparently is his favourite drink. I'll shout that. I mean, I'm getting desperate now, you know. I'm getting wet as well. Monsieur Chomo! J'ai un cadeau pour vous! I have to say that I'm going to give up now and go and try and get a bit drier.
After 3 hours in the rain, I was completely soaked. Never mind fuck wet, this was fucking wet cinema. As I enjoyed the benefits of the car's under-seat heating, I wrote Shomo a note, letting him know that I'd kept our appointment and I would return at 2 the next afternoon. I was determined not to give up now, even if I was getting on his nerves.
Être prince dans la nuit, quand on mendie le jour.
I had a very strong Groundhog Day feeling as I approached Shomo's place again. I really didn't feel like another cold shower without anything to show for it in return. Then I caught sight of a figure at the gate. It was time to stop filming and take a leap in the dark. I parked up and ran to the gate. By the time I got there, the figure had disappeared, but the gate was open. As I made my way down the path, strange chiming music began to play from deep in the forest. At the end of the path I found a gong. The figure I'd seen earlier reappeared. It wasn't Shomo, but a woman dressed in black. She seemed to be running the show now.
La grande marche des révoltés, des créatures de Dieu. Marche vers la reconquête du ciel et de la terre.
So I've just been in Shomo's place, been there for going on for 3 hours. There was no way we were going to be able to take a camera in. It was his wife who met me and took me in first, and it was quite worrying. Well, I was slightly worried at some point that he was actually dead, because for the first 2 hours or so she was referring to him, but there was no evidence that he was around, and seemed to have gone in just about every room that was there. And then the bottle of port was offered as a present, which she took into a room, and then she said that he would talk to me for a short while, and went in, and lo and behold, he was sat in a very, very small room with a kind of electric storage heater at the side of him, working on a painting. He wanted to tell the UK about his paintings what his paintings now is cellular art. He believes that all things, from the smallest parts of life to the biggest things like planets, it's all based around cells of round objects. I mean, obviously, it's a bit disappointing not to have got in to film him and talk to him, but at least we know he's still alive, which is good. And he's got a sense of humour. He was quite funny. He did keep repeating this thing of, you know, cellular art is the future, and, you know, everything else is over. I am the saviour of the art world or whatever. But you know, he was together.
The end of my journey was now just 300 miles away. As I set out for the palace of Postman Cheval, the building that had first sparked my interest in all this business, it was funny to think of Shomo still out there in the middle of the forest, happy to be the saviour of the art world, but refusing to get involved in it. I was disappointed that I hadn't managed to get him to contribute in person, but I wasn't going to let it spoil the whole trip for me. So far, the places I'd seen and the people I'd met had only helped strengthen my belief that there was much more to art than just the stuff that hangs on gallery walls. I arrived in Postman Cheval's village on his birthday. Had he still been alive, he would have had 162 candles on his cake today. Thousands of people descend on the tiny village on this day each year to celebrate Cheval's achievement by walking the 20-mile-long route of his post train. Feeling stiff after my drive, I parked up and walked the remaining 400 yards to the entrance of the Palais Ideal. When Ferdinand Cheval was about 30, he had a dream in which he saw a fantastic palace. On waking, he couldn't remember the exact details of the dream, but never forgot the impression it made on him. For the next decade, as he walked the countryside delivering his letters, he fantasized about constructing the building he'd dreamt of. Then, when he'd all but given up hope of ever doing anything about it, he tripped over this strangely shaped stone. I think it's appropriate that the Palais Ideal's starting point was a dream, because dreams are both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. Everyone has them, though not everyone can remember the strange things that happen in them after they've woken up. Cheval not only remembered his dream, but turned it into a reality. By using improvised techniques and following his instincts, he created a dream that you can now actually touch, walk around, climb on. And he invented an early form of reinforced concrete in the process. The palace has been here for years, and you can buy any number of souvenirs featuring pictures of it, but it still looks like it just landed from another planet, like it shouldn't really be here at all. But it wasn't built by aliens, or even a famous architect here on Earth, but by a common garden postman who tripped over one strangely shaped stone whilst walking his round, and just liked the look of it.
At first, I filled my pockets with stones, ripping them to the great displeasure of my wife. Then I started collecting them in baskets on my back. Later, I began to make piles of stones that I would go back and collect at night with a wheelbarrow. When the night drew in and everyone else was sleeping, I worked on my palace. No one will ever know of my troubles.
Maybe that was Cheval's idea of a joke, because just in case the sight of the palace itself wasn't impressive enough, he'd then covered it with inscriptions, boasting of his achievement. My own favourite detailed not only the exact time it took to build from start to finish, but also issued a challenge. 10,000 days, 93,000 hours, 33 years of struggle. Those more stubborn than me get to work. The next day was a Monday. All the hikers and tourists seemed to have gone home, and village life returned to its normal pace. Today the mail is delivered by a female, and the 20-mile post round is no longer covered on foot, let alone with a wheelbarrow. On the edge of the village I spotted what could have been someone starting to construct their own dream. They seem to have one up on Cheval in terms of equipment, but I guess only time will tell whether their vision in concrete will outshine his. Back on the main street, I came across a baker whose work bore a striking resemblance to Cheval's, although it turned out that his chocolate palace was not his proudest achievement.
Je suis le créateur des pierres du palais idéal. Ça fait 15 ans que j'y pense et j'ai travaillé 5 ans dessus. L'intérieur, c'est un praliné nougatine avec un chocolat très fin, enrobé d'une glace royale. Une glace royale, c'est comme une meringue, mais ce n'est pas fait pareil. Ça peut se garder 6 mois, très longtemps.
The baker's version of Cheval's stones may not have been quite as impressive to look at as the real thing, but they did taste quite nice, even when I found them in the back of a cupboard at home months after I'd bought them. It's ironic that Cheval is now the village hero, because in his own day he was seen as something of a madman. Maybe the only reason he didn't end up in an asylum is because nobody knew who'd walk his 20-mile post round if he wasn't there to do it. Cheval had originally arranged that after his death he would be buried underneath the palace. But in the end it took so long to build that by the time he'd finished it, this was no longer legal. Far from being discouraged by this, at the age of 78, he set to work on constructing his own tomb in the local cemetery. It took him a further 8 years. The tomb isn't quite as large and ornate as the palace, but then maybe Cheval knew that his time was running out. In 1924, 2 days after he finished writing his autobiography, Ferdinand Cheval died, and his body now lies here, in what he called his tomb of silence and eternal rest. After all the work he'd done, I reckon he deserved a rest. I'd set out on this journey looking for a kind of art that really meant something, and in the places I'd seen, I'd found it. These weren't places that needed to be propped up by an explanation. You just had to go there and experience them for yourself. It was as simple as that.